Hi all, this is Alessandro Mastroianni. I'm a composer, sound designer, and product expert for Krotos. Today I have a very exciting guest with us. Is a sound designer, supervising sound editor, re-recording mixer, and the founder of independent post-production studio based in Burbank, California. This is Sound Design, Nathan Ruyle. Hello, Nathan. How are you?
Hi, it's great to be here with you. I'm excited to chat about sound design.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to it. So the very first question that I ask all my guests is that essentially how you got started in the industry. Now you have a pretty amazing IMDb credit list. I was reading, you have something like 100 features under your belt. So how did you get here? What it was your journey into sound design?
I started out. I grew up in the rural Midwest in the U.S. Outside of St. Louis. So I was a long way away from Los Angeles and Burbank. And I got interested in theater. Even I went to a little small town high school, but we had a really great theater and music department. And I got interested in theater, and I got interested in music. And then in high school, I got into garage bands, and my best friend and I started writing music. And he actually his parents bought him one of the first digital Porta Studios. It was this Roland. It was basically a Roland 4-track recorder, but it had a hard drive, and it had effects, and so you could track digitally onto this like little mixing recorder, very much like a kind of oversized 4-track, and then you could do effects, you could do reverb, and you could mix on it and do down mixes. And so in high school, I got sort of interested in digital recording. Kind of at that point, I would have said I was more of a singer and a musician. I wasn't really an engineer or a designer, or didn't really know technology, but I was immediately really fascinated by it. And actually, when we were still in high school, we ended up doing a score for a student film, and we actually got asked to do a little bit of sound design work on that film. And and I remember we were like beating on a trash can. We were like making big booms, beating on a trash can with pillows in it. So it's like I was like 17 years old. I was already like making Foley, even though I knew nothing about it, like in a garage in like, rural Illinois. But I think I kind of caught the bug for recording then. And we continued on, and through college kept writing music, kept making recording music with my friends. We built a little studio. Eventually, we got into, at that time I think we were running Cubase. And then at some point in college, I sort of got interested in Pro Tools, and I was actually studying theater in college, and also kind of music production and writing. And I at some point, and I was studying theater mostly as an actor, so I was actually acting and singing and performing. At some point, I had a mentor of mine, Bill, and he said, "Hey, why don't you take your music recording thing that you do, and why don't you do some sound design for theater?" Because we were doing this really cool play called Marisol, which is this like magic realism play by Jose Rivera. It was a really cool, creative kind of project, post-apocalyptic. He was like, "You should, take you're doing all this cool music stuff. Why don't you try to bring that into this project?" And it's sort of at that point something clicked for me, and it was like everything I had been interested in up to that point all came together. And so from that point on, I kind of pursued sound design. I did a little performing, I did a little music work, but out of school, I actually got a job working in theater in St. Louis doing sound design as a job, as like a 22-year-old kid. And so that was kind of where it started for me as a profession. Continued to do sound design mostly in theater, and then I had been really interested in. At some point I decided I did want to go to graduate school. I did want to further my studies, and I was kind of weighing different options, and I applied to NYU and got in their new media program, ITP, which is a really cool, interesting, a lot of like creative technology work, which I was very interested in. But then I also applied to Cal Arts, which is the school, if you guys don't know, it's a school that the Pixar people came from. It's probably the most famous alums. But it's in the for those folks here who are interested in kind of experimental music, and Buchla taught there. There's a whole world of Tom Erb was there as kind of an amazing experimental technologist musician. So there was also that kind of thread happening there as well. And they had a really cool theater program there that was really hybrid. And what I actually learned when I went and visited is that I had one of the professors say, like, he's like, you can go to New York, you can go, NYU's awesome. He'd actually been an alum of NYU. He's like, NYU's awesome. He said, but New York is New York. And he said, it's really hard to do your own thing. It's really hard. It's like, it's a really tough city to kind of make work in. He's like, in LA, in California, he's like, man, it's the Wild West. You can do whatever you want out here. And actually, Cal Arts, when it was founded by Walt Disney, it was the idea was that it was supposed to be this kind of hybrid creative lab. And it was actually the first art school that combined music, performing arts, and film in one school. At that point, most conservatories were separate. You went to a music school or you went to an art school. So it was kind of in the ethos of the place. You could do really hybrid, interesting work. And it was like, even the way Cal Arts works, it's like the first day of school, you basically go and you can petition to get into any class in the entire institute. You just go talk to the professor. And so you can do experimental music, you can do theater stuff, you can do film stuff. And so for me, that's exactly what I wanted, because in the same way that I had sort of found this hybrid between music and theater, I kind of felt like I'm really interested in movie making. I'm really interested in performance and theater and art making. And so this is kind of a place where I can do all those things. And it proved to be that. So when I was at Cal Arts, I really went there to transition into film. And I had, at that point, done sound design work professionally for about 5-6 years. So specifically in performance. So at Cal Arts, I really got to, a lot of my film professors had, they were just people who'd worked in the movie business and really kind of learned the intricacies of Pro Tools and learned about, frame rates and projection and all these parts of the real technical side of the work. That's kind of essential to function in sound for movie making. But I also, Cal Arts is this incredibly collaborative place. And so for me, I really leaned into conceptually and practically into sound design and thinking about sound as a design process. And, the program I was in there was actually housed in the theater school, and and Cal Arts is sort of famous for their design in the theater program. It's like people who went on to do amazing things at Cirque du Soleil, people who go on to Imagineering and build rides at Disneyland, and are the Imagineers. It's like, it's a really interesting, cool part of that place. And you get a really awesome, intense design education where you really, using theater as a context, you really engage just kind of, what does it mean to be a designer? What does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to think about the material that's presented to you? What does it mean to kind of just be daring, to be to go against the grain, to all these things that I think are what make a great designer, which is ultimately a person who is really able to generate ideas and then realize them in a practical way. And so for me, by the time I got out of Cal Arts, I mean, I was fully committed to this idea of sound. And so, I was lucky of sound design and being a sound designer and kind of what that meant both practically and realistically. And then I came out of grad school and I was told by some people pretty quickly, there aren't really sound designers in the film business. I think that's not true. And we have some great examples of it. I actually wrote an article for Movie Maker magazine a while back talking about the idea of sound design in the film business. And there are people who were called sound designers. Walter Murch was called a sound designer who worked with Coppola, did The Godfather, did The Conversation, Ben Burt, Gary Rydstrom. There's some great people who have taken on that moniker. Alan Splett, who worked with Lynch, one of my all-time favorite sound designers. But in general, in the film business, it's like there's really more supervising sound editors, which is kind of like the manager of the sound editorial. And certainly there's sound design in all kinds of ways. It's funny. Randy Tom was just on the internet this week saying, like, Foley is sound design, dialogue editing is sound design, and I think there is a conversation around what sound design is, which we could talk a little bit about in the context of the industry. But ultimately, when I came into the industry, being like, okay, I'm going to work on movies, I had already at that point been to Sundance and worked with a lot of directors and had some successes, and a movie that won the Independent Spirit Award. So I was already kind of starting out, and I was also teaching at CalArts in the film program, and I was using their facilities some and working with students there. So I was already kind of on the path, but wanting to kind of really be a person who works in Hollywood, some people kind of told me, well, sound designer, it's like kind of a person who works with sound effects, but it's not really a thing. It's like your re-recording mixer is sound editor, supervising sound editor if you're kind of in charge. And so so that's why I founded my company with the name This Is Sound Design. Because for me, I saw innately, I was like, well, this doesn't really make sense. Like, I understand it's like in a managerial and practical way, if you're managing a big team of 20 people on an action movie, it makes sense to be like supervising sound editor. But what I was interested in was like, not necessarily doing everything myself, but like I was interested in the kind of the design process and the relationship I had with the other filmmakers, the director, with the composer, with even the choices the production designer was making, or, so for me, I was like, well, I'm really committed to this kind of idea of like realizing, thinking conceptually and then realizing it in the context of making movies. And I don't really feel like there's a place to approach it specifically in this way. It was like in Hollywood, it was like, oh, well, you need to like get in at the bottom and work your way up. And, eventually you could be mixing movies. And I was like, well, I'm already mixing movies and they're getting awards and they're going to Sundance. So I don't know if I need to like enter this kind of system. Even though I understand that's practical, and for giant Marvel movies, it makes a lot of sense because you're wrangling an army of 50 people, So ultimately, that's what led me to start my own company, and it first started in a garage, and then I'd rent out a mix stage to mix a few days, and then it had another iteration that's been about, I guess, coming up on 10 years ago, where we moved into a small facility with a smallish mix stage, that like a TV size mix stage I shared with another company. Kept growing the company, kept doing movies. Kept going to Sundance and South by Southwest, and building a lot of great relationships with filmmakers and producers. And so now here I am. This is the latest iteration, which is our new standalone facility here in Burbank. We built it over 3 years from a bare warehouse. And you can go on the website tisd.tv. There's a 3D tour there, so you can kind of check out what we're doing. And that was a real interesting process. There's the conceptual and the creative and that part of it, which I love, but then there's also just the reality, which is that if you're not going to go work at Warner Brothers, or you're not going to go work at one of the facilities, and you're going to keep doing bigger movies, you have to have a place to do the work. So I had to take a big swing and kind of go for broke and kind of put it all on the line to build this space. Though, I sensed that we were headed this way. So over many years, I was kind of building up, building a BSS system. We bought the S6 console here that was, this was actually the first S6 in North America that was sold. So I was like early adopter. And even that was like for me, the S6 was a big revelation because it's sort of modular, very programmable, very kind of like piece of technology that can respond to how I want to work as a designer. And for me, when I say designer, it includes mixing, it includes editing, it includes all those things. For me, mixing and editing are, they're all sound design, and they're all part of a kind of process that starts when I have the first conversation with the director, kind of thinking about what the movie could be in terms of the sound, through the last day when we're printing the movie on the stage. And I'm, and for me to like dissect those or deconstruct those is almost impossible, because I'm doing as much design in the mix stage as I am in the editing room. But yeah, so we built this facility. It's never fully done. In fact, this room I'm sitting in, this is our A stage, which is a theatrical Atmos stage as of a few weeks ago. So it's a full Dolby, will be a Dolby certified theatrical mix stage with 28 full size surround speakers and a 239 projection screen. So we're always we're constantly evolving and kind of figuring it out. We're also constantly figuring out like, oh yeah, we didn't do the acoustics perfect in this ceiling. We got to come in and rework it. So even in that, it's been a process. And even for me, even that is part of my kind of life and work as a sound designer. Like building this facility was drawing on a decade of thinking about how do I want to work? What size rooms do I think are going to facilitate the kind of work I want to do? In this facility, we have a theatrical stage that's Atmos. We have a TV-sized Atmos stage that we chose specific speakers for. And then we also have a near-field room. Every one of these rooms, we're really thinking about, how we want to work, and also kind of like where movies are going, what's happening. We're in this interesting period, especially after COVID, where it's like, what is going to happen with theatrical movies, So even in that, when we built this space, I was thinking about, what is the future of making sound, and how can we physically create the space to be able to do that? So all of that, circuitous, but all of that to me is ultimately kind of the story of, where I am as a sound designer and where This Is Sound Design is, which is,
Yeah, really cool. So you already sort of briefly mentioned that you don't really like the distinction, but I would imagine that there is some difference in the different hats that you wear depending on the project that you're working on, probably depending on the budget. And so especially for people that might not be completely familiar with the differences between a re-recording mixer, a supervising sound editor, can you tell us a little bit on how, I guess, your role and your approach to a project changes when you when you're called on different roles? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we do a variety of size, scale in terms of budget, and and sort of ultimately where a movie's going to end up, and all these things are practical considerations for kind of what the process is like. For me, the number one thing is that to speak about how I see myself as a sound designer, and I'm kind of an advocate for this in the industry. I'm kind of writing about this and talking about this because I think we are, sound for movie making is in a little bit of a identity crisis, I think, because ultimately we're in a deindustrializing phase of this work. And we're kind of almost the last of that goes all the way back into the studio era in the 50s, right? Which is like, and even going, through the 80s to do this work was, it was like to mix a movie took an army of people. It took because you were using dubbers, and to get 100 channels, which each dubber has 8 channels, and somebody has to load the tape on and off the mag on and off of those dubbers. You can imagine just that crew, how big it has to be. And then all the other parts, because it was so manual, and you're cutting mag. So, so sound up until kind of digital came in was this really super labor intensive thing. And so because of that, certainly there was incredible creative work. If we look at King Kong, or we look at the work that Murch was doing in Apocalypse Now, there's some incredible work that was being done before digital was happening, but it was really a huge team sport. It's almost amazing to me that it was possible to do some of the things they did, given how crazily labor intensive it was in the analog era. But, now here we are in 2022, we've had Pro Tools now for what, like 30 some years. And yet, we're still a little bit in a phase where the way that the work is approached is still kind of based on the models from the analog era, right? Where it's like why editing and mixing were so separate is because they really were very different parts of the process, and required a really different sensibility and skill set. Whereas now we're in Pro Tools, right? And so, it's not a thing where it's like I'm mixing on a giant analog console, and to get a new sound effect in means somebody has to literally go cut a piece of mag and put it on a reel and get it onto the console to be able to do it. And so those lines are very blurred at this point. And so for me, when I say sound designer, again, it's a confusing term. In the industry, because of this, what I see is that sound designers like production designer or costume designer, it's the person that is creatively driving the work that's happening on the project. And so within that kind of leadership role of the sound designer, you could be solely editing, right? And just cutting sound effects and cutting dialogue and maybe working with a small team of people or a large team of people doing that. And you're kind of organizing and creatively guiding that process and participating in it. Or you could be, on the mixing side, it's similar. I mean, you're literally like using these tools to get your hands on to the sounds and shape them into an experience, right? That now is spatialized and incredibly immersive and requires a real sense of experientiality and really to be able to put yourself into the world of the audience and how they're going to experience. So you're kind of shaping an experience as much as anything. And, both of those things could be different people. For the work that I do on most films, I'm doing both of those. And so for me, ultimately, it's kind of built into the name and the way we approach it is that, the sound designer is carrying the creative vision. And in most projects where the scale allows for it, I can be there day one when we're spotting the movie. At this point, in terms of editorial, I'm almost always working with a team that I've worked with now, for a decade. I have a dialogue editor that specializes in dialogue. I have several effects editors that I work with, and some of them have different specialties within that. And then, we have a dedicated Foley artist, Mike Miller, who's in-house here, and he only does Foley for us. But, ultimately, for each one of those people on my team, where we're moving towards is that I want every one of them to feel like they are a sound designer, and that, our goal is for everybody to kind of take more and more of a role in shaping the vision of the work, and that extends into the mixing side of it. And, there's even, Wiley Stateman, who works with Tarantino, and, he's one of the really amazing sound designers working in the business today. He says this thing, or he has this concept called ABM, always be mixing. And so what he says, and I completely agree with this, he's like we're moving out of the time when a sound editor doesn't have to be able to approach the material as a mixer as well. And so the way he kind of is training his team and working with his team, and he, he's promoting an idea that, as the editors are working, they're not just like laying down sound effects on tracks and leaving it to someone else to integrate, but they're always also shaping the material. And, they're kind of, in a way, doing what we often call the premix of the material. They're doing that they're starting at least the first pass of that as part of the editing process and as part of the design process. And that's, again, I am 100% on board with that. I think that's really where we're going. And, but it is still a huge collaboration. And right now we're doing a very big movie that's basically almost a 6-month long design and mix process called Cabrini. It's a historical epic, and it's it's a very dense sound design. It's a really kind of movie that has hundreds of extras and, incredible weeks and weeks of Foley recording that are going to be done. And in that regard, even in the mix, we're going to take that to the Ross's mix stage here in Hollywood. And we're going to work with John Ross is actually going to take on the music part of that process. I'm not going to deal with the music at all, and I'm going to focus on the rest of the elements, because that project alone is going to have a giant orchestral score. They're recording in Rome, so it's going to have a lot just with the music, and so it's going to be great to have a co-mixer, and that's pretty common on a larger scale project, right? That you'll divide up the mixing workload so that when you're in the big expensive mix stage, you're trying to maximize the amount of work that's getting done while you're on the stage. So I hope that gives you kind of a sense of the overview and how it's evolving.
First of all, I love this sort of creative vision that everybody is part, is responsible for shaping that overall sound design concept. And then you were talking a little bit about, the tools that you have in front of you and, the way they help you shape your creative vision. And especially you briefly mentioned Atmos, and in general, the fact that sound is becoming as immersive as possible, and the industry is definitely going towards that direction. Talking about workflow, can you tell us a little bit how you use Krotos plugins to this extent? And I don't know how much you can say, especially about this, the project that you're working on at the moment, but if you give us, specific use cases, that would be really fantastic.
Yeah. Krotos software specifically, I mean, we're a very technology forward company, and we're always kind of trying to embrace the latest technology, like the S6. This is the first S6 that was in North America, because I think we're in such an exciting time for what's happening with audio technology. And it's just, what we're able to do on so many fronts is kind of mind-boggling, and we really try to embrace it as much as we can. Krotos software is a great part of that. I have a pretty long history with the kind of, as a designer, working with some of the kind of conceptual techniques that Krotos software is kind of, in a way, packaged in the really much simpler and easier to use form. That means that we can get out of the kind of underpinnings of the technology to just get the work done. I bought a Kima sound computer like 15 years ago when I saw Ben Burt using it in WALL-E, and it was a great experience. I don't know how many people you've talked to have had a Kima or have much of a conversation about it. It's, even Ben Burt, I asked Ben Burt about it, and he was like, oh yeah, I mean, the Kima's great, but it's a tough piece of technology to work with, because it really requires a deep knowledge of synthesis, and it's literally its own program language for creating sound.
I'm surprised you're talking about it. We were talking about it just at dinner a few weeks ago with a friend who was telling me he was surprised that I knew Kima. I said, but also no, because you're Italian. And apparently he told me that Italian sound designers love Kima,
oh, yeah.
Which I wasn't aware
okay.
of. But that sounds interesting. I had a bit of experience with Kima, and yes, it's complicated, to say the least, but very interesting. And I'm surprised to hear you talking about it.
I mean, what I would say about the Kima, I have such respect for the people who made it. It's such a unique. It was made by this couple at University of Illinois. And it's a really important piece of technology, because it really is the kind of it did a bunch of things first that are really important, and it's in some of those Star Wars movies and things when you just literally couldn't do this in any other way. Gary Rydstrom and Ben Burt were using it. Ben Burt used it to make the voices synthesis in WALL-E, who he is the performer WALL-E using it. for me, it's a really incredible piece of technology, and it led me to read a lot and learn a lot about synthesis, and read all. I really had You have to dig deep, and out of that, what I came away is I really understood synthesis in a way I never would have. But then around the time that I really started to understand how to use the Kima, IRCam came out with some products using cross synthesis, and then there's been a kind of steady stream of software, and Krotos is kind of now they've taken it to the next level with Reformer and with Dehumanizer, that like that it's like using these techniques, but it's like really turnkey. And so, very often, and I think the most critical piece is that the working in picture, you're dealing with sync, so latency becomes a real issue when you're doing this kind of design work. And one of the things I love recently, we were using Reformer to do some voice manipulation, because we can work with it in real time. So in this case, we were doing we partner with AFI and do a lot of AFI short films and work with the students there. It's great for us because we can, it's great because we use it to train our younger staff, and also it's just fun to work on student work because a lot of times they're very open to trying cool, interesting new things. We just did a project with one of the AFI students called the Earl King, and it's based on this European myth about a tree man. And so we got into Reformer, and we built out these several layers of Reformer patches where we're dealing with the wood texture in the voice. We're also using the panther sound. We're layering up all these elements. But the thing that's so cool about that is not only are we doing great synthesis with the voice, but the performer who performed the voice could work with it in real time. So we could actually let him rework the performance of the character, hearing himself through the software. So he was actually able to really shape the performance that we ended up with. And I think it ended up so much better because we could work in real time in that way. And I think it's the same thing where, in more practical ways, we're using Reformer to, texture Foley. We're getting ready to, in Cabrini, we have scenes where you have a vast expanse. It takes place in kind of turn of the last century New York City, and you'll have scenes where there's 100 extras off in the distance walking around through these muddy streets. And so one of the cool things with Reformer is we can actually just texture, add mud, add these sounds to the feet. So it lets us, we can create so much through Foley, and then they can start to differentiate and texturize it in post, which is really powerful. I saw the sound designer that did Batman talking about doing that with on the stage. You can add a little bit of grit to the boots without going back to the Foley artist. Things like that are just incredible. But beyond Reformer and Dehumanizer we use all the time. I did a movie that came out during the pandemic called What Lies Below, and it's it ends up being a creature movie, but we were able to use Dehumanizer to make some incredible sound. And again, it's so easy when, specifically a movie like that, which is a fairly low budget movie, it's one thing when you have a giant budget where you can spend a lot of time, iterating and trying things and recording. A lot of the movies we do are on the lower end of the budgets. And so, being able to quickly shape something and not spend days working on it is really important. And I think that's just the reality of a lot of the movies that are getting made today. So, being able to work quickly and in real time is important. Though we're doing another movie right now called Supercell. It's a storm chasing movie. We're using Igniter for wheel sounds. We're using Igniter for engine work. And again, it's this is a lower budget movie, but it has a lot of driving and action sequences. So it's something we can actually, it's very much in the world. To me, when I'm working with Igniter or working with any of those products, it's that, being able to kind of really work in real time. To me, it equates a lot to even trying to cut Foley out of a library versus cutting Foley shooting Foley, it's just so much more efficient. And it's the same when using a product like Igniter, because it's like it's all there and you can be kind of shaping something. And once you've kind of created, ultimately your instrument for what the vehicle sounds like, you can really start to cover a lot of ground very quickly and end up with a result that oftentimes is just better than what you would have otherwise. We have another movie we just did. It's kind of still, it's not finished yet for Universal, but it has a lot of. I probably shouldn't say the name of the movie, but it has a lot of robots in it. It has and a great example of that was that we needed there's a moment where a character like jumps in a Prius and it drives away, and it was like, we didn't even have any Prius sounds in the library. We went in Igniter. It's like, oh yeah, of course, there's a Prius in Igniter. Perfect, So it's like also like the way that they're constantly bringing new material is awesome. So we actually own one of the everything full blown every bundles, and I'm thinking we may have to get a second because we're so busy these days. A lot of times we're working, we need to be using Igniter in 2 rooms at once. So that's a good testament to like how important the Krotos stuff is to us.
To do this, and we really spend a lot of time, and I don't want to steal any more of your time, but I would really love if, to end this, you could give a little bit of a career advice to, people that are crazy enough to to decide that they want to enter in the industry, because it is, after all, an incredibly fun and satisfying journey. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. So, what's your advice on that?
Well, it's like it's the industry's in I'll speak to the film industry part of sound because that's mostly what I do. I think there's, like I said, we're in a transition, and we're kind of in this what I say is a kind of deindustrializing. And so, the industry used to be very mentor oriented. It was very much about apprenticing and working your way up through kind of existing structures. And I think one of the big challenges right now is that a lot of that doesn't necessarily exist in the same way that it did. And so in some ways that's a challenge, especially if you kind of want to approach the industry in a very traditional way. On the other hand, the technology is so democratizing, and there's so much potential for being able to kind of create and kind of work at a pretty amazing scale without having to be sort of like in a big studio, for instance, as just one person in a big corporate situation, and I think we're probably, on that track. This is probably the best example of that. And, I think in that regard, the real secret is for me. And when I'm thinking about, and we're constantly trying to kind of develop and work with interns and work with young sound artists and sound designers. What I'm looking for more than anything is that kind of creative spark, and that kind of willingness to really engage the material in a creative way. And I think that's something that, ultimately what kind of propelled me into doing my own thing and building this independent company is that a lot of the sense that I got in the industry is like, well, this is how we do it, and this is how it's done, and this is how it should be done. And I think in most cases that's antithetical not only to the most creative, interesting work, but also just to where we are with the technology, and what's possible. And so, I think my advice, I think it's always going to be unique to each person. I think for some people, school makes a lot of sense. And for me, honestly, I think when I went to graduate school, my undergrad experience was really interesting, and I had worked in theater, and I had definitely been exposed to kind of creative thinking, and I had worked as a theater artist. But for me, going to a place like Cal Arts as a graduate student, where I was really given a design education and really challenged to think creatively, that to me was like that's everything. Everything I've built here is based ultimately on that. Is like that I learned how to really, grab a hold of the work in a creative way, and to really, and then everything else comes around that. And so I think for some people, going and doing a formal education makes sense. On the other hand, and I will say also, I will give CalArts a little bit of props. The film industry is tricky because there's so much kind of high level technical skill required, and it's often really hard to find that in a book or find that on a forum. It's just it's a real collective knowledge, and you need to find people that you can that can help you. And I have a very close friend, Nathan Crow, who's the technical director of the film school at CalArts. I call him all the time with a technical question, even though I'm, obviously very tech savvy, because you need to have those kind of resources. And so that is important.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to say that I love that it's like a bit of a refreshing perspective to have this opinion on education, because I think, and I'm interrupting you because I would love your take on this, that education is living through a time where there is a lot of bad rap on it, and I agree. Like I really enjoyed my education, and I think Berkeley, which is the university that I went to, it was gave me a lot of skills, and and so it's sort of a refreshing perspective in what you're saying in a day and age where everything is available as a YouTube video, and and as you're saying, the technology is so democratizing.
Right.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing around that is that relationships are so important. And specifically, and I think you have to be thoughtful. I think there are some educational situations that are probably a little bit of a snake oil, and they aren't really. I think sometimes it's heavy on technical and light on creative. And I think, for me, the other thing is, as a person who went to CalArts, I can trace every single job I've done in the last decade to all this game of telephone and word of mouth from the people I started working with in school. And it's all about building those networks of relationships. And so I think that's also a really critical piece of that. On the other hand, I also think that, the other key to it is that you have to have an incredible work ethic to succeed in this business. And it just requires a lot of hours and a lot of energy. And there's not any, in my mind, there's no easy way to get there. I mean, maybe, sometimes there's a little story here or there, especially in the music industry. Sometimes it's like, someone just kind of came up with a really interesting style as a producer or something. And, they really blew up quick, and that's cool. Good for them. I mean, that's a testament to creativity. But I think specifically in the film business, it takes a lot of experience. It takes a lot of, it takes 10,000 hours plus, I think, to really, because it's such an elaborate process. And, specifically in the kind of work that I think is the future, because we're thinking also about the future, which is a world in which it's not about, I just cut Foley and that's all I do, and that's all I know how to do. We're really entering a phase in which, the process is more holistic. You're really expected to have a more mastery level of Pro Tools. You really need to understand not just how to edit, but also how to mix. All of these kinds of ways that you have to evolve. And I think that for me, school was a big jumpstart to that. I also think that you can also, you can start in the trenches if you're going to work really hard, and you can also learn. But in either way, you're going to have relationships, and you're going to have mentors, because there's no world in which you're going to learn this by going on forums and reading books. And, I think that is a reality. I will also, though, give a couple for people who are kind of interested in, or maybe you're even Pro Tools, you're an experienced person working with sound, but maybe you haven't worked in the film industry. There are a couple books I would recommend that I think are really great. One is the Dialogue Editing for Motion Pictures book, which is by Focal Press. when I taught at Cal Arts, there was a book I always had my student reads. And anytime we now have an internship program here, that's the first thing I have the interns do is read that book. And there's a recent edition that really has been updated to deal with new, technologies and ways, because dialogue editing is evolving a lot, and it doesn't even go into like kind of some of the programs for now aligning dialogue, which has really changed dialogue editing, for instance. But that's a great kind of a beautiful book that it will both give you insight into how to think about dialogue editing and how to think about, because half of it, dialogue editing, is about prepping material for mixing. And, and it's really a great window into understanding how the process of editing works in a film context, and how there are rules and there are ways of approaching that really make a difference. So I definitely recommend that. There's another book on the creative side that not a lot of people know about, called Audiovision. It's by a French theorist that his name's Pierre Nora, and it's kind of the only kind of film theory book about sound. And it's kind of written by a film theorist. He's an expert on Bresson. He's an expert on David Lynch. He's written about some of the great sound-centric directors. But he wrote a book on the kind of theory of sound in movies. And it's such a great book to just get you thinking about how sound works against picture in the kind of fundamental way. And outside of technology, outside of Pro Tools, outside of thinking about it as a task, but instead thinking about it as ideas and kind of as in a perceptual way, which I think is so important for where we're headed with Atmos, with kind of the experience of cinema. It's a really great kind of window into that.
Cool. Thank you so much. I really don't want to take any more of your time. You are very generous, and love this chat, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm so honored to be on here, and I shout out to Krotos. That's like it's a kind of integral day-to-day part of what we're doing as sound designers. So keep up the good work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Bye.
All right, thanks.